Okay, Simon, so welcome to the Institute and
Very happy to be here.
the University of Liverpool. And tonight, of course, you're going to be speaking about one of the greatest poets of our age, Seamus
Yeah.
Heaney. And of course, we'll come on to that.
Very happy and very nervous to be doing that, really. Because I feel he's over my shoulder.
Well,
He was such a tough tutor.
he's tough to touch you.
Behind the smile,
Yeah, that's the thing.
there was
And
the ultimate scholar.
that's the really important thing to understand about Seamus Heaney.
Yes.
Because it's that what we call cultures or rural people.
Yeah.
They always have this smile, but
Yes.
smile is not.
You'll be happy. I mentioned
It's not the
exactly.
urban smile.
I try and describe exactly that smile in the course of the lecture because I remember it very well.
Because when somebody from a rural background in Ireland is going to take you apart, the spine is actually broader because they've got the anticipation of delivery.
Yeah.
And of course, that's an important thing about Heaney, isn't it? Is that rural background, and of course,
Right.
this was a person who ended up at Harvard and ended up being one of the most famous poets of the post-war era.
Yeah.
But I don't think he ever lost that sort of sense of gentility and that sense of being where he was from.
Yeah, no, he absolutely didn't. But he had this incredible quality of expansive generosity.
Yeah.
So that it's all over the poems too. So you start with something very local and very concrete. It can be the blossoming of a bud in the spring or something, or it can be a cow strikes him or something like that. And you build from the bottom up into something which is universal and might actually be profound and dangerous as well. So that's the way Seamus. I chose. Can't wait to hear Leanne Best read them, but I chose a really terrifying but beautiful poem called Casualty, which is about this eel fisherman, Louis O'Neill, really, but you begin with the way he looks, actually, in the way he orders a drink with just an eyebrow, actually, in a pub, and the poem builds to his death and an explosion in a bomb explosion. And so Seamus actually knew, I mean, that was a very particular secret, and you say, and it seems self-evident, well, that's what poets do. And he often credited Wordsworth with doing that, actually excessively, is my view. As a matter of fact, I'm slightly harder on Wordsworth than I am now on Seamus. I'm not hard at all on Seamus. I think Wordsworth had a problem doing that, but he wanted to do it. But there was a sort of sense, really, in which memory, which could be a good thing, or it could be a very divisive and tribal thing, and the thing that makes you defensive and perpetually harping on about memory, that such a deeply Irish and Jewish thing. We talked about what we had in common about that a bit, and or memory can actually root you in the daily practice of what it's like, particularly to live in the countryside, and that has. It's somehow those poems and those thoughts, because he was an incredibly good lecturer as well. I used to go and sit and listen to him at Harvard. They were amazing lectures. That sort of approach is, I'd say, anti-ideological. That's to say, it takes the canting and the ranting of the kind of billboarding out of actually what's dividing people or what can bring them together.
It's actually
that's what you want to do in poetry, but it's very, very hard to achieve.
As we were talking before, very much of my life growing up during the conflict in Northern Ireland and being surrounded by, death of friends or murder, whatever you want to call it, of friends. And it was actually things like the point you made there about non-ideological.
Yeah.
In that when he spoke about the sectarian dock worker, he was doing it in a way which was to get you to think.
Yeah.
He wasn't doing it in a way which was to get you to condemn. And that seems like a lot of his poetry, especially the early poetry, where he talks about like evangelical Protestants. He sort of has a respect for them. And I think what's interesting there is when you talk about Wordsworth doesn't really do it the same way that Seamus does it. I think one of the strengths of Seamus Heaney's poetry is he grew up in that rural, literal community. A and B, black and white, yes and no.
That's true. Wordsworth went to Cambridge.
That's the.
He didn't come from a very posh background, but he went to Cambridge, as did Coleridge.
But the point is, he could take the guy sitting in the house reading the Bible, and that relates to all sorts of faith and the sort of patriarchal dictums or the power of that, and how you could take that from a very small rural community. I think it was his ability, whether you agree or not, would be interesting, how he took the literal and turned it into the figurative in a way that I'm sure other people, and maybe that's what you're saying about Wordsworth. He had an ability to do that, but maybe others didn't.
Yeah, I think so. But I think yes, I mean the point where one changes into the other is the poet's magic if they do it really right. I mean, one of the poems, I don't know if you one of the other poems I chose to be read is one of the early-ish ones called The Other Side, which is exactly exemplified everything you've just been saying. So but there are phrases where Seamus, for example, talks about, he said his brain was a whitewashed kitchen, swept tidy. And the image
like the body of the Kirk.
Yes,
like he's a Protestant.
Yes, exactly, like the body of Kirk. And it's a fantastic poem, I think, actually, because it is about what it means to be a neighbour without the kind of obligation of sentimental empathy, which is very hard to do. So they're both rather, Seamus is rather steely. The Protestant farmer talks about the earth as being as hard as Lazarus. It's actually being not very neighbourly about the likelihood of making a living out of this field. So that is so absolutely real.
There's also a word in that.
So it's never sentimental.
There's also a word in that poem where he's talking to the Catholic. So Ulster Protestantism is literal. It's literalism. You know, it's why we have all these little churches that have split and split and split. That word in the Bible means that. That's what. And there's a bit in it where he's obviously the Protestant is talking to the Catholic, and there's a word they use in rural Ulster which is believe. So he basically says, "I believe you don't hold to the book." So he doesn't say your religion is the opposite to mine. He doesn't say you should hold to the book. He just puts in that word believe. And the area he comes from, somebody wouldn't say for example, you stole a car or something. They wouldn't come up to you and say, you stole a car. They would say, I believe you were seen in a car that was stolen. and it's that, you know, you just think as a child, he must have had a level of curiosity that just rippled out into this. Capacity.
Well, the calibrations, the psychological calibrations are so minute and so fastidious and so delicate and so subtle and so true. It comes from the experience, I mean, that poem, but many other places in James's writing, it comes from the experience of living beside someone, even if there are walls and graffiti on them, essentially understanding and dealing with what it means to live beside, being contiguous without wanting to replace them. That is, you know, we said we wouldn't talk about the Middle East, and I don't particularly want to, but the living beside is absolutely totally gone in the Middle East.
If his work is sort of, obviously there's a variety of work, and we're talking very here much about identity and those divisions between people. But there's one thing he does in his work is he shows us what the difference is, but he shows us how they're kindred. That there's something below the surface. So my mother's family were those types of people. And, you know, the 12th of July, the big Protestant festival, the Catholics would milk their cows, you know. On the you know, if they had trouble with a piece of machinery, the Catholic would come and fix it, and they would do the same. And it was sort of, they would sit in the house, read different Bibles, go to different churches. Clearly had a different opinion about the constitutional question. But behind all of that, they were actually the same people. And I think that's what Heaney was trying to tell us. It's okay to be different. You know, let's focus in on the kindred.
We didn't talk about you wanted to do this, but you wanted to talk about the Curate Troy a bit, actually. And it is an amazing thing. And it was done at the time where the hero really is John Hume, you know, isn't it? Because he's actually sounding out the possibility of what can be done other than simply screaming at each other and wishing each other dead.
I think it's a bit of the Cure of Troy, which is the most magical part. You used the word magical earlier, which is the bit where he talks about, you know, a new child is born. And basically, you know, and there's thunder on the mountainside. And isn't it interesting that thunder and rage is also conflict? But Heaney was able to tell us that thunder and rage was also the power and dynamic of peace. And very much he invested a lot in the peace process. He invested a lot in using his work and his mind and his talks to basically, you know, that earlier work about kindredness and all of that there. He very much advanced that. So this brings me on to something. So in
I mean, I will say this just before we go to the next thing. I do think one of the things, I mean, already around the Hall Lantern time when I knew him in the middle of the 80s, you know, it's obviously long pre-Nobel Prize winner, but Seamus would always not so much the smile warning, but the kind of droll chuckle, which was self-mocking slightly. He always was slightly allergic, really, to the notion of being the man on whom everything would depend. He, on the one hand, again, and I haven't actually said that particularly in the lecture, but I walk around it a bit. On the one hand, you could not do nothing. You couldn't be indifferent. But on the other hand, you didn't want to be, I mean, there was something in him that resisted that dreaded word icon, really. He didn't want to be saintly in that way, and he temperamentally wasn't.
It comes from that culture, that Northern Irish culture. You just shouldn't get ahead of yourself. That's for other people.
Yeah.
It's that sense of the big house and the small house.
Yeah.
If you get ahead of yourself, you're starting to behave like the big house.
Yeah.
You're not behaving, you know, British society's flatter in that way, you know, there's aspirations to rise to the big house. There's still a bit of reservation about that because you will change.
Yeah.
You'll read poetry and you'll go to opera and you'll just not be one of us anymore. So the story of us on BBC, I'm sure it's still an iPlayer, excellent series. I'd actually like to thank you for that.
Oh,
because it spoke very much, I think, to my sort of sense of Britishness, although I will consider that it's also Irishness as well. But I think the state of us was not just a celebration, but it struck me very much like Orwell's thinking about patriotism and identity, was what actually unites us. And patriotism should be about creativity and achievement. You know, it's not, you know, I love the work of Orwell when he says things like, the Liberal wouldn't stand for the national anthem, but they'll dip out of the poor box. You know, that keen eye he also had, very like Heaney, a very, very keen eye. And I enjoyed the program because you know, there was all this sense of, in my lifetime, you know, music. You know, Britain is exceptionally gifted at genres of music, and it just never stops. So you know, Beatles, ska, punk, new wave, whatever. I'm sure, I don't know what the young people listen to now. I don't know what it's called. Seems to be a lot of noise, but anyway, but it's just superb at that. It's superb at comedy. It's superb at that. And when I watched the program, and I very much enjoyed the program, and I just looked at this lifetime. And I'm not saying that, you know, you also deal with this as well. It wasn't perfect. We had the National Front and the BNP. We had the conflict in Northern Ireland. You know, we had other things which were troublesome. But it seemed that, you know, that program sort of took us on a line of progress. How the society progress. Now, after watching it,
well, we ended, I have to say, you know, and some people thought, well, you would end, having said that Seamus was never sentimental, and I don't think of myself as sentimental either, but we ended with the acme of feeling Britain as a nation of, you know, a mansion with many people living inside it of all different kinds. And my own Jewish experience obviously was, to me, you know, growing up, evidence of that. But we ended in the Olympic Games opening in 2012. But the danger there is being, as you know, was said actually by one of the people I interviewed, you know, danger is being too misty-eyed and nostalgic about actually Britain being. But I do think, you know, if I want to grab onto something hopeful, even with the kind of xenophobia, which seems, you know, which it's thought wins votes really, in Nigel Farage and so on. Again, if you summon Orwell, or even the sort of, even though he was a bad boy during the war, P.G. Wodehouse says in one of those novels has a kind of, and I think actually Wodehouse describes Roderick Spode as amateur dictator, which I think is kind of only an amateur dictator who has a group of fascists called the Black Shorts, really, and they are by definition ridiculous and don't fit and are completely out of kilter, really, with British temperament, actually. And I think Orwell felt it was a kind of, you know, because Orwell also wrote about sort of humorously dirty seaside postcards.
Of course,
and so Orwell felt it was a kind of that we're a nation of habits, I think, really, and not
characters.
And
characters.
Yes.
He remember, I can't remember what it's called now, but that brilliant piece he did about the what do you call a commercial salesman, a commercial rep.
Yeah.
And just his life is just ordinary and mundane. It just goes round in circles.
Yes.
And it's that, you know, that bit.
Oh, you mean the novel coming up for air?
No, this is Orwell, and it was a short story.
Oh, okay.
Which is so he would defend his sense of Britishness against fascism.
Yes, right.
But he would also write about maiden aunts and you know, men whose lives were repetitive, dry, and not very boring. And I remember he wrote a brilliant story about Arsenal playing Russia, and of course he's on the left, and expects the Russians to be superheroes, and the Russians come out in washed out kit, and it's the point he starts going, maybe I'm a socialist, I'm not a communist. Obviously that's sharpened up by the Civil War, Spanish Civil War, etc.
Right.
But the point about that program is that there, as you say there, that you and Seamus are sentimental, but you can't watch a history of a nation and celebrate. I know you're the same as me. It's not all misty-eyed.
Right.
It seems strange to me that if I watch that and others watch that and they're sentimental about achievement, but you consider yourself not to be sentimental.
Well, I distinguish. I mean, sentimental, I think, is sort of in the red zone of deliberately not seeing things as they are. I mean, I had a very one of the things I wanted to do with the history of Britain all those years ago, 25 years and more, was actually obviously tell stories first and foremost, because then actually narrative history was very unpopular, both on it seems amazing, both on the page and especially on television. Everything was fly on the wall. So I wanted to get bums in seats really by bringing the narratives to life, but I wanted to do it in such a way that questions would be asked. And of course, actually, when we got to Cromwell and Ireland, this became extremely important and painful and so on. So I actually did, there was a very particular issue, and I can't remember, I probably still to this day not satisfactory, but the issue is Cromwell certainly had a lot of people murdered in Ireland, but were they prisoners who were murdered, or were they civilians? And the evidence is simply difficult to disentangle, and probably people are going to scream and shout at me. But in any case, that's on a reading. But I felt I had to lay that out without actually having a particular stake in one side or the other. So that was a kind of, I think Seamus also is clear-eyed about things, but you do so because you're. One thing Seamus was amazing at, of course, is empathy. Is actually bringing a poem sufficiently to life with a kind of rinsing clarity, sort of seeing people dead on. That was something actually Wordsworth did want to do. He said, because he chose Thomas Gray, the 18th century poet, as an example of bad poetry, really, because absurdly obsessed with finesse and just stale metaphors and badly transcribed versions of the classical pantheon from Ovid and so on. And instead of which, Wordsworth said, I want my readers to keep company with flesh and blood. And he kind of does it, and he kind of doesn't do it. But that's certainly what Seamus did. So you see people, you smell them, you see how they're dressed, you see what their body language is, you listen to how they talk, and that's all credible. And it's not just, I think, due to where he comes from, actually, in the countryside. I think it's also he never stops looking.
Of course not.
And the gift, which is not, which is an incredibly uncommon gift. But he worked at it, of course. They didn't all come, sort of. They weren't simply beamed down.
I'm afraid,
but he had the gift of very precise description, actually.
I think,
and he would work at that precision of language.
Of all the creative capacity that we have and all the forms in which we produce creativity, I would argue that poetry is the most difficult.
I'm very glad to hear you say that, because actually one thing that really surprises my graduate students at Columbia, as I said, the one thing I would tell you to do is just read as much poetry as you possibly can. And they say, why? I said, you're working with language. And I don't care if you're writing nonfiction and think of yourself as an historian, you need to read poetry to understand the imperatives of exact description, and also what hinges on the order of words, and how you lay sentences down on the page. And the only people who really will teach you that properly are poets. I once tried to give a course at Columbia called Poetry and History, and my colleagues banned it, actually. They thought it was some sort of horrible soft option. Someone said to me, well, that's a soft option. I said, when did you last write a poem anyone wanted to read?
Exactly.
He still didn't know what I was talking about,
Because if you actually think, the difficulty of doing that is, you and I, obviously I don't write at the same level as you, but if we write an academic article, you will go through drafts and drafts and drafts. But you imagine the poet goes through draft upon draft upon draft upon draft. So you can write a clever lyric for a song, and we know there's great songs that have been written in a couple of hours. But nobody's dissecting, because the distraction is the music. When you have the cold, sober page, people will think that word's just not in the right place.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Are you a great reviser? I'm an obsessive reviser.
whenever I write, if I need 10,000 words, I write 30,000 words, and then I keep paring it back until I have 10,000 words. But I would never be content. But
oh, well, that's,
yeah,
come on.
yeah.
I mean, anyone who says, and there are occasional friends of mine who write this, have said, well, I certainly nailed that. You lose respect for them.
The one thing
I don't know any of my majestically brilliant writer friends who ever are satisfied. They've got their book in their hands, and you have that moment. So
I think
you have a kind of 10 seconds of thrill when you open the book and say, what a clever boy I am, or girl I am. And then you think, oh, shit. I tell you one good story is the last book was about a history of vaccines, which I wrote during COVID.
Yeah.
And my wife's a scientist, so otherwise I wouldn't have dared to do it, in the 19th century. And for the first time in many years, I said yes to audio, to reading the whole thing. And you get to a certain page, and there's a paragraph there that, like a jack-in-the-box, comes up and screams at you, and you thought, this paragraph is so bad, I couldn't possibly have written it, but of course you have. Yeah. So I discovered that when you're doing the audio, you can fix it, actually.
Exactly.
Absolutely, I made massive changes.
Every time I've done a book and it's arrived, which is a great moment, you know, this is your labour, you've put ideas into this, you've sweat and tears, whatever else.
Right.
And every time I've done a book and written a book's arrived on my desk and I've opened it, the first page I open it on, there's always a mistake.
Yeah.
I don't know, how does that happen? How does that happen?
I know.
You can go through the whole thing and not one mistake. It's always something. Or else your initial reaction is, did I really write that?
Exactly.
So therefore it goes back to the further you stay away from hubris, the better.
Yeah.
You know, when you believe your creativity is exceptional, then and I'm sure Seamus knew that he was exceptional, but probably didn't admit it to himself.
Yes, I think that's probably exactly correct.
That level of humility. So going back to the story of us.
Yes.
And thinking about that program and obviously with the Olympics, which we all watched that night, and it was MHS and Mary Poppins and all those things which frame identity and culture.
Well, there's many things going on all at the same time, not necessarily in the right order.
Exactly.
Morecambe and Wise said, and that to me is British. I mean, that I thought,
it doesn't have to be a thing. It doesn't have to be prescribed.
Yeah, I mean, because it came on the heels of, I think the Chinese Olympics had happened before, immediately before.
Yeah.
And that was exactly the monolithic drill, the perfect monolithic drill of interchangeable parts called human beings doing their dance marches.
How could our culture and identity not be messy when it has changed so much with immigrant family Jews, Huguenots?
I was just going to say,
that's right. How could all of this not have changed? How could it not be messy?
So it's the elasticity of national feeling, national communion, national identity, which I think is a genuinely,
I suppose, a very
precious thing in British identity.
I think what we're both saying is a very British value is being small b British.
Yeah,
it's actually about taking all of these things on board.
Yes,
but now, since that program was made, my mind just turned a wee bit, and thinking about the program, etc. We just don't seem to be in a celebratory space now. We just don't seem to have that. I think you are right about the Confederate, loose, bumbling along sense of what identity is. But we just seem to have gone somewhere now, which it just makes you feel that we're not celebrating creativity anymore.
Well, I think this is. I'm hardly the first one to say it. It's not a very original thought, but that may not necessarily mean it's untrue.
Yeah,
and that's of course the web, algorithms. Make money, help people make money out of conflict and of anger and of rage, and doing all the things we've just been talking about, being understanding what it means to live beside each other, doesn't seize the economy of attention, and it doesn't rile people up, and riling people up makes money. It's clickbait. And again, it's a sort of cheap answer to why everyone, but it's also thought to be vote catching as well.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is the epitome of that. You make money. The first big speech he made after coming down the golden escalator in 2016 was this kind of mad, delirious vision of rapists and murderers and their millions crossing the border unchecked and so on. So, and his speech writer, now the Deputy Chief of Staff, really running domestic policy for Trump, Stephen Miller, wrote this extraordinary kind of dystopian speech of America, basically reduced to carnage and pools of blood and rubble, really. And that got people, gave them a kind of license to be really, really cross.
But so
really
what happened in
upset.
America when
So,
we think of things like In the Heat of the Night, Rod Steiger,
yeah.
and we're taking on racism. Guess who's coming to dinner? All of that. It seems to have lost. That sort of 60s, 70s equality, liberalism, feminism, challenging prejudice. I think all those things are still very strong. I think those things are as endurable and as strong as they've ever been. What it seems to be is, I assume you're like me, a flag's not something you're going to hoist in your garden or outside your house.
We do occasionally have been known to hoist the Union flag on July the 4th in the Hudson Valley in America, just to annoy our neighbours.
You might be back.
But there you are, somebody who's doing that.
We might be
back. It's a joke, actually. So.
But there is this thing now, which is the flag, the flag on the lamppost, which is trying to take us back to the white sense of Britishness.
In Northern New York, I hadn't caught that. I thought of that, and a good friend of mine who's on the radio a lot said, "Oh, she wants to do a program with me about flags." And I thought, why do you want to do that? And I just kind of missed all the flagging going on. Actually, we used to talk about as students in the 1960s flag wagging as a kind of pitiful comedy, actually, really, and something designed to make the blood boil. And then flags suddenly, particularly the flag of St. George, that came from. But the flag of St. George then became a kind of it became controlling of body language. Yeah. I mean, it was a form of kind of road rage, really, and which was kind of awful and absurd, I think.
Because as a historian, of course, so I'm a social scientist, so we look at things as far back as yesterday.
Yeah, right.
but in many ways, I think that's interesting, because there must be times of history in which society progressed quite rapidly, and then it hit a moment. Obviously the 30s is one.
Yeah.
When the Jewish community in Germany were more integrated than it had been at that time. They created a reaction against that. If you think about Northern Ireland, Van Morrison, etc., Belfast was becoming this sort of small metropole of blues music, and you're all of this creativity. People were socializing together, and then comes the shock of conflict. And of course, conflict, I think, in Britain today is not just immigrants. I think it's the failure of government, the rollback of the welfare state, and people's lives are hard, etc. But it does seem to me that when we think about, so we can have these sort of golden moments like 60s Belfast or 60s, 70s, 80s Britain, and then we've gone into this other thing. So historically, that's probably happened before, as I've said. But all of this
many times, I think.
Yeah,
it's always very in almost arbitrary a bit why it happens. I mean, obviously the kind of experimental buzz of the years before the First World War. The trenches ended that, really. Yeah. But they did go on then after the war. But it was not the same at all. So I mean, there and revolutions that go wrong. Yeah. Revolutions that in the beginning seem to be absolutely right.
All religions begin with pacifism.
Yes, well, Wordsworth is the best poem on that still, both in the prelude. But so it's very hard to say. It's not like somebody ordains a shift. Yeah. I remember actually one of my favorite films, sort of Men in Tights historical costume film from the 1950s. It purported to be about the life of Michelangelo. So I think it was called Man of Florence or something like that. Anyway, I do remember it starred a very minor, very good-looking British film star called Edmund Purdom, and as Michelangelo. And what I will never forget is that he rides into the square in Florence, which is really Elstree Film Studio, jumps off his horse and is into the loggia and says, "Men," and it was "Men of Florence, the Renaissance is here." I thought, oh, history is really easy. You just sort of catch the smell.
The Ice Age will start.
Wind.
The Ice Age will start on Tuesday.
Exactly. There's another one. I mean, a friend of mine, John Brewer, collected these. There's a film, and I can't remember what the name of that film was, but much later on. And a husband says to his wife, they're living in a kind of rat-infested cottage somewhere. Yeah. Who knows where? Said, well, goodbye, darling. I'm off to fight the 30 Years' War. It's a great thing. Well, history is everything. These big billboards come down, you know.
But it does seem.
But these changes do happen. They are definitely. I mean, you always want to say, well, to whom do they happen?
Yeah.
You know, there are still people living in poverty and rage, while the Beatles are, you know.
I think one of the problems is
queuing up the hit list.
We have the struggle, so obviously multiculturalism in Britain, and we have that struggle each time a migrant group arrives. There's a struggle and whatever.
Yeah.
But we always get to the moment where Brick Lane becomes that fascinating, wonderful space that we can all enjoy. You know, so it's not beating up Bangladeshis and all of that.
Yeah, my mother was very good at that. Actually, she became in her late middle age and early old age. I think it's okay, Mum. And she was kind of queen of Jewish welfare in the East End.
Okay, yeah.
But she was very welcoming. I mean, I think she'd be suffering a lot from the abuse hurled at Jews in the name of Zionism. But she was very welcoming to the Bangladeshi community, and there were synagogues that were the Jews were dying out, and they were going to be mosques. And my mum was. Who was not a especially tolerant person, actually. And she had a kind of low boiling point. But she was very good. So that, again, was absolutely an inherited understanding of what we'd been talking about. And she would say, actually, well, Spitalfields was Huguenot. You know,
of course.
Park was Huguenot. So there was us, and then there was us, and then there'll be them. You know, that genuinely didn't bother her.
Have you ever watched Lee Stewart? You know the comedian Lee Stewart?
No.
Okay, he does the.
Oh, yes, Stuart Lee.
Stuart Lee, sorry.
Stuart Lee. Oh, yeah.
Have you seen the bit he does about migrants?
They're coming over here. Yes, it's very funny. It's very
when
good.
the fish came out of the water.
Yeah, that's
no
right.
sugar nose and their lace work. But the thing is,
the beaker people.
The beaker people with their.
What's wrong? Why can't you drink like cats? Yeah, exactly.
But the thing about this, the point I was trying to make is, you see, when we get into these sort of more golden moments, I don't think we know that we need to sustain them. Because when we achieve something which is positive, you know, feminism, you know, women coming, you know, women in the workplace, controlling their bodies, etc. We don't always remember that positivity will always have a pushback, a backlash, which I think is economics in most cases. I think when economics are, you know, we think now about Cool Britannia and the Blair era. You know, at that time,
I think living in America, I think it's not just economics, but it is not detached from it entirely. A lot of the license to rage that Donald Trump incredibly successfully weaponized and mobilized is to do with education, and still in whichever poll you take and whichever election happens, including the one happened a few weeks ago, it's very striking how college educated people vote in different ways than non-college educated people. Although interestingly, Peter, in these last votes, and I'm thinking about the governorship of Virginia, not New York City race, but in the governorship of Virginia and the governorship of New Jersey, non-college educated white men were voting against the Trump, which is a sign that people move back towards the center a bit. But the sense in which education got you respect and a very large wage was part of it. So it's partly the sense that the educated would be holding their noses at the uneducated, and also that they had somehow entitled them both to social respect and also a much bigger wage packet, which is actually not necessarily truly the case. School teachers and so on.
I think also the problem with those of us who be sort of liberal left or whatever our identity is or politics are, is that, you know, not people like us obviously, but there was too much looking down your nose. When somebody is saying about going to the GP and it's full of immigrants, I don't want to hear them saying that. Okay, what I want to hear them saying is that's the product of cutbacks.
Yeah,
that's the product of an economic system or a welfare system that doesn't deliver what it once did. And maybe you have to go through that to have that education, because I think there is an interesting thing about the white lower middle class American coming back to the Democrats, which is they trifled with something and then they found it was more abusive. Or you just look at TikTok now and there's so many people saying, I lost my business, I voted Trump. There's an Irish woman who's probably going to be deported after 50 years of living in America because she a couple of years ago she wrote a check that bounced. Her and her husband voted Trump. You know, there's the farmer who's talking about we'll be bankrupt next month because we didn't think they'd take away our workers.
Right.
So a lot of stuff, despite our fascination with culture and image, and
that's
a lot of stuff
that's
is gritty. It's what actually happened,
and that will decide the midterms and the presidential election. That's quite true. Yeah.
So just to finish up, and obviously, I think we could talk all day, obviously, and hopefully we'll do so again.
That would be nice.
So obviously, as somebody who's looked at your work, and we talked a bit there about politics, etc. So you did this excellent work about the medieval period, and I must say, which I'll say in my talk tonight, actually, my parents left school at 12 or 13, okay, and but they were taught history as narrative, story, okay, and it was interesting that, you know, when I think of my father in particular, he could talk to you about, he would have loved your type of programs. So although he wasn't educated in the way that we were, probably had skills you and I don't have, you know, but you know, you can fix a plug and fix a car.
You know, I can't do that.
Send me there.
I'll read a carburetor.
I'll read a book.
But you're a cook. I'm a big cook.
Yeah, but the point is that they loved history when it was story.
Yeah.
And they could connect it to their kindredness or their heritage, etc. And then we sort of taught history in a way that wasn't that.
Yeah.
And I think the power of what you've done in your program,
and still are more and more, unfortunately.
Yeah. My two children, Aoife and Rory, did their O levels or GCSEs and A level. They just did the Second World War twice.
Yeah.
You know, there's something there that's not there. And what's interesting is the way you do that narrative construction, which then I hopefully has come to a younger generation who know that history is stories and narrative, etc.
I tell you, again, just trade thing, actually, we were talking about this at lunch, that I was partly helping with thinking about a new history curriculum for state schools in Britain. And so I used to go around to schools and ask the wonderful history teachers what was on their mind. And they would, one after the other, would say to me, we don't have enough time. We have an hour a week, maybe, if we're lucky. And it's very difficult, actually, to tell stories in 5 minutes before, because you've got a list of bullet points.
But as a teacher, if you're trying to explain something theoretical, it's difficult at our level, third level.
Know how
storytelling helps you say, this theory, well, let me give you an example.
Yes, exactly.
And it's the storytelling,
exactly.
which is...
That's fundamental to what it's like to being a language animal, isn't it? To being human.
Of course. Yeah.
That's the thing,
Well, that takes us on, obviously. We'll talk about indeed about your work on landscape and memory, which is other important, because you do what I think, you know, the alienation from nature. You know,
that's another reason I love Seamus's poetry, of course, and why we did what we did in the program with Tolland Man. I mean, I was so struck by the fact that it was Seamus makes so much of this in many poems, but particularly in that one of digging down deep, actually, you know, beneath the bog. Actually, somehow if you excavate or you simply explore subterranean, you'll find layers of memory, and you'll find.
I thought one of the strengths of there are many strengths in that book, but one of them in particular was, hopefully I read this properly, wilderness is no different to the manicured garden.
Exactly.
And I think, you know, it's the sense that nature gives hope. Well, as well as destruction.
That's right.
So one of the things that...
Are you a gardener?
Oh, yes, love it.
I'm a bit of a gardener. So
exactly.
For me, the triumph of surviving yet another winter in the Hudson Valley is the first snowdrop, actually.
It's the first snowdrop.
The first snowdrop. It's a tiny little pathetic thing.
And also...
you know, amidst the frozen dog shit and piles of leaves
it's the way
I'm here.
It's the way in which global warming means that the thing you planted that used to die in early September can now exist October. But you sometimes look at it and go, there's a few years in me late. You know, sort of, you sort of connect it and go, that can survive. But the point is, I was going to say about the medieval stuff, oligarchs, we seem to be back in the age of the oligarch. It seems that, you know, I don't like that.
It's more, I think it's less, you know, feudal Britain, really. It was a kind of contract between protection and immediately very harshly exploited service. It's more creepily like the 18th century when, you know, the word oligarch was used a lot. It's like people who are absolutely in charge of the stock exchange or the Bank of England through the South Sea Bubble or the slave trade, or, you know, who were really making piles of money and pouring piles of money into Westminster, into politics, absolutely capturing that, are like the kind of bros in Silicon Valley who are not interested in democracy at all.
Of course not.
And who think actually they're cleverer and smarter and
they like
are richer.
They like
and therefore they're the people who actually be ultimately pulling the lead.
I think in a way that takes us back to the whole point about how we had this progress and change, and maybe the oligarchs didn't like it.
Yeah.
So just to finish off, and thank you very much for your time. So tonight, just for those who can't be here, can you give us a few pointers before on
yes,
the politics and the poets?
Yes, I suppose it's really about something which happens in Seamus Heaney's prose as well as in some of his poems, and it's a very old tug. It's the tug of war between the need for poetry being poetry, having detachment, not, I think I'd say at some point, not subjecting yourself to polemics really, or not being trapped by polemics. What we talked about when when I was making a point about being against ideologies. But on the other hand, not therefore living entirely within the world of words and the music of words. So it's a kind of negotiation really between the times and the what makes poetry different from a newspaper op-ed editorial, and that you know it's the people I visit with after talking about Seamus a bit in one particular poem are the biggies, all of whom, except for one, Seamus spoke very eloquently about, and how I heard him. Shakespeare in particular, I heard Seamus lecture about Shakespeare at Harvard, and it was an absolutely unforgettable lecture. And and in the poem, one of the poems where he read Alphabets, he talks about the globe spins and being on the wooden O at the Sanders Lecture Theatre where I heard him. But what, of course, he has at the back of his mind is the Globe Theatre. So what I visit with poets who are all put on the spot by that question. Following Shakespeare is Milton. Milton's first poem, anonymously in print, was an epitaph for Shakespeare. Wordsworth, who writes, "O Milton, thou shouldst be here at this hour." And finally, Walt Whitman. And then, oh, well, for people who can't be here, this is tough luck because there's a big surprise at the end. Well, I'm asking, I will say this, and then all of you'll probably immediately figure out. I'm asking people to think of and read a very famous piece of prose as though it were a poem.
Right.
And it has an effect, I think. I mean, it's a piece of prose that really changed the world, and particularly changed the country. So guesses out there, write into email
the Institute of Irish Studies at. I think both of us agree that Seamus had an impact, even though you're not sentimental, but I think we all are to some extent.
I am sort of about him, actually.
Exactly.
I miss him something rotten.
The thing I've enjoyed about this conversation as we talk about Britishness and identity, you're like myself, it's just all messy, and that's okay.
Yes,
it doesn't have to be
prescriptive. Well, one of the wisdoms of my father, Arthur, the wisdom which my wife is so upset about, one of my father's most famous sayings was, "Never trust a man with a tidy desk."
Exactly.
And and my desk is like havoc, really, actually.
Exactly. So thank you very much for that. And I think
pleasure.
In many years to come, actually, that Heaney will be like those other great writers and poetry.
Oh yeah,
he will stand the test of time.
No, that does already.
And that does already. When my academic articles are no longer read, I'd assume that Seamus will still be something that people learn from and people engage in, and not bad from a guy from a small village who becomes a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Cheers.